I turned 86 on a quiet Sunday evening in late October. The leaves outside my dining room window had already turned the color of rust and copper. The air had that crisp chill that settles over our town every fall, the kind that makes you reach for a sweater even inside the house. My son insisted on organizing the dinner. He said an 86th birthday deserved something special. So he made the calls. He invited the family. He even brought over 2 long folding tables to extend the dining room. By 6 o'clock the house was full. My granddaughter arranged white candles down the center of the table. My daughter-in-law placed a chocolate cake in the kitchen, carefully covering it with a glass dome like it belonged in a bakery window. Someone opened a bottle of red wine. Someone else turned on soft music in the living room. From the outside, it looked like a warm family celebration. And for a while, I believe that's what it was. I sat at the head of the table, the same chair my husband used to take every Sunday before he passed. It had been 12 years since Walter died. Sometimes I still catch myself glancing toward the door at dinner, expecting him to walk in with the evening paper under his arm. But that night, the chair beside me stayed empty. My son Mark sat across from me. His wife Linda was beside him, smiling politely, the way she always does when other people are watching. Mark had already poured himself a second glass of wine before the roast chicken was even carved. He's always been the kind of man whose laughter grows louder with every drink. At first the evening moved easily. People talked about the weather. About football. About how fast the grandchildren were growing. Every now and then someone would look my way and say something kind. 86 looks good on you. You're still sharper than all of us. I smiled. I thanked them. But something about the room felt different. It was small things. The way conversations paused when I spoke. The way Linda kept glancing at Mark. The way Mark's voice got a little louder each time he lifted his glass. By the time the plates were cleared, the candles had burned halfway down. Mark stood up suddenly, pushing his chair back with a scrape against the floor. He raised his wine glass. "All right," he said. "I think it's time for a toast." Everyone quieted. It's funny how quickly a room can change. Just seconds earlier there had been forks clinking against plates, quiet chatter drifting across the table. Now the only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. Mark swayed slightly where he stood. Not enough to fall. Just enough that you could tell the wine had started doing the talking for him. He lifted his glass toward me. "To Mom," he said. A few people murmured politely. My granddaughter smiled. I folded my hands together in my lap and looked up at my son. Then Mark chuckled. It was the kind of laugh that makes people shift in their seats. He tilted his glass a little higher and said, louder this time. "To the old lady who still won't let go of Dad's money." For a moment, no one moved. You could feel the words settle over the table like a sudden draft through an open door. My granddaughter stopped smiling. Linda stared down at her plate, though the corners of her mouth twitched like she was trying not to react too quickly. Someone at the far end of the table cleared their throat. Mark looked around the room, grinning like he had just told the best joke of the night. "Come on," he added, waving the glass slightly. "You all know what I mean." No one laughed. Not a single person. I watched the candlelight flicker against the rim of his glass. I noticed the red wine had left a small stain on his sleeve. For 86 years I have learned something about silence. Silence tells you more than people realize. It tells you who is uncomfortable, who is embarrassed, and who is waiting to see what you will do next. So I didn't interrupt him. I didn't scold him. I didn't even raise my voice. I simply looked at my son. Because in that moment, something became very clear. This dinner, this carefully planned birthday celebration, had never really been about my birthday at all. And Mark wasn't finished talking. For a few seconds, no one said anything. Mark was still standing with his glass raised, waiting for the reaction he thought he deserved. His smile lingered on his face, wide and careless, the way people smile when they think they've said something clever. But the room had gone very still. My granddaughter Emily looked down at the tablecloth, slowly folding the corner of her napkin between her fingers. She was 22 now, old enough to understand when a moment had turned uncomfortable. Across the table, Linda shifted in her chair. She gave a small laugh, thin and quick, the kind people use when they're not sure which side of a situation they're supposed to be on. "Oh, Mark," she said lightly. "You've had too much wine." But she didn't actually ask him to sit down. And Mark didn't stop. He took a slow sip from his glass, like he had all the time in the world. "You know what I mean," he said again, looking around the table. "Dad worked his whole life for that money." His voice had grown louder now. The words weren't slurred exactly, but the wine had smoothed away the edges of caution. He wanted the family taken care of. He gestured toward me with the rim of his glass. "But somehow Mom here thinks it all belongs to her." A quiet breath moved through the table. Someone near the end shifted their chair. Another person stared down into their empty plate as if the roast chicken might suddenly reappear. I kept my hands folded in my lap. At 86 years old, you learn that reacting too quickly rarely improves a situation. Mark leaned one hand on the back of his chair. "You know how long it's been," he continued. 12 years. He shook his head slowly. 12 years since Dad passed. The mention of Walter's name floated across the table like something fragile. My husband had been a careful man. Quiet. Thoughtful. The kind of person who weighed every decision before speaking. Mark had inherited very little of that. "Dad trusted her," Mark said, nodding toward me again. "He trusted Mom to do the right thing." Linda glanced toward the kitchen. For a moment, I thought she might stand up and change the subject. Maybe bring out the cake early. Maybe start pouring coffee. But she stayed where she was. Mark looked directly at me now. "Don't you think, Mom," he said, his voice almost cheerful, "that it's about time you let go of Dad's money?" The candlelight flickered across the table. I could hear the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway. Tick. 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 It's strange what your mind remembers in moments like that. I remembered another dinner table. Another evening. Years ago, when Walter was still alive. He had been sitting beside me, stirring his coffee slowly, watching Mark talk about business ideas and quick investments. After Mark left that night, Walter leaned back in his chair and said something I never forgot. "Money has a way of revealing who people really are." At the time, I thought he was speaking about strangers. But sitting there at my 86th birthday dinner, with my son staring at me across the table, I began to understand that he hadn't been talking about strangers at all. Walter and I had built our life slowly. When we first married, we lived in a small 2-bedroom house on Maple Street with a kitchen so narrow you couldn't open the refrigerator and the oven at the same time. Walter used to joke that if we ever grew rich, the first thing he would buy was a kitchen big enough to turn around in. But Walter never cared much about appearances. What he cared about was security. Every Friday afternoon he would sit at the dining table with a yellow legal pad and a small calculator, writing down numbers in neat rows. Mortgage payment. Utility bills. Groceries. Savings. He believed a family should always have something set aside for the future. Not for luxury. For stability. By the time Mark was in high school, Walter had already started investing small amounts. Nothing flashy. Just steady accounts that grew quietly over the years. I remember the day he bought the lake house. It wasn't a mansion like the ones you see in magazines. Just a modest cedar place 2 hours north, sitting beside a long calm stretch of water where the mornings were so quiet you could hear loons calling across the lake. Walter said it was the one place where the world seemed to slow down. Mark loved that house when he was younger. Every summer he would run straight from the car down to the dock, kicking off his shoes before his feet even touched the grass. I can still see him diving into the water, shouting for his father to watch. Back then, the lake house wasn't about money. It was about weekends together. Fishing lines drifting in the water. Walter teaching Mark how to steer the small aluminum boat. Evenings when the three of us sat on the porch with lemonade while the sun sank behind the trees. But time changes people. Especially when money becomes part of the conversation. The first time Mark asked about Walter's finances was just a few months after the funeral. He came by one afternoon with Linda. They sat at this very table, the same place where he was now standing with his wine glass. At first, the questions sounded harmless. Did Dad leave everything organized? Do you need help managing the accounts? I told him I appreciated the concern. And for a while, that seemed to be enough. But the questions kept coming back. Every few months. Then every few weeks. Mark would mention the lake house. The investments. The retirement accounts Walter had spent 30 years building. Linda would smile politely while he talked, but she rarely interrupted him. She just listened. As if she were measuring every word. The tone slowly changed. Concern became curiosity. Curiosity became expectation. And expectation eventually became something else entirely. I saw it clearly the night Mark first used the phrase that stayed with me. He leaned back in his chair and said, almost casually, "You know, my Mom, eventually all that's going to belong to the family anyway." At the time, I simply nodded. But Walter's voice echoed quietly in my mind. Money has a way of revealing who people really are. And over the past 12 years, I had learned more about my son than I ever expected to know. Mark was still standing across the table from me, the stem of his wine glass pinched loosely between his fingers. The candles had burned lower now, their light smaller and softer, but the tension in the room had grown heavier. No one seemed eager to speak. My niece Carol quietly pushed her plate aside. Someone near the end of the table reached for their water glass but stopped halfway, as if even that small movement might interrupt something important. Mark looked around the room again, waiting for someone to agree with him. When no one did, he let out a short laugh. "What?" he said. "You're all thinking it." His eyes moved back to me. "I mean, come on, Mom. Dad's been gone 12 years. Linda shifted slightly in her chair beside him. She placed her hand lightly on his arm, not quite pulling him down, not quite encouraging him either. "Maybe we should bring out the cake," she said gently. "It is a birthday, after all." But Mark shook his head, still smiling that loose, careless smile. "No, no," he said. "This is part of the celebration." A few people looked at each other uncomfortably. I could see Emily glance toward me again, worry flickering across her face. I gave her a small reassuring smile. At my age, you learn that embarrassment doesn't last forever. What matters more is what people reveal about themselves while they think they're in control of a room. Mark leaned forward slightly, resting his knuckles on the table. "All I'm saying," he continued, "is that Dad worked 30 years building that nest egg. 30 years. He held up 3 fingers as if the number needed proof. And it's just sitting there." The way he said it made the word sitting sound almost insulting, like the money itself was being wasted by existing quietly. I looked down at the candle in front of me. The flame bent slightly each time someone shifted in their chair. Mark went on talking. "You've got the house paid off. You've got your pension. Social Security." He shrugged. "You're comfortable." There was a strange tone in his voice now, something that sounded less like a toast and more like a calculation. "But the rest of us," he added, spreading his hand toward the table, "we've got families. Expenses. College tuition. Real life." Linda nodded faintly beside him, though she still didn't look directly at me. I could almost see the story forming in Mark's mind as he spoke. In that story, he was the practical one. The responsible one. The son simply asking for fairness. But the truth about stories like that is they rarely begin the night someone finally says them out loud. They begin years earlier, in quiet conversations and small expectations that grow slowly over time. I had watched those expectations grow in Mark for more than a decade. I had heard them in the way he talked about the lake house. The way he mentioned the investment accounts Walter had built so carefully. At first it was curiosity. Then it became something closer to entitlement. And now, standing at my 86th birthday dinner, he seemed to believe the entire room would support him. Mark lifted his glass again and gave it a small swirl, watching the wine move along the inside of the glass. You know, he said casually, most people would have passed things down by now. His eyes met mine again. Most people would have let the next generation take over. The clock in the hallway ticked quietly behind us. I folded my hands together and looked calmly back at my son. Because the thing Mark didn't realize was that I had already made my decision about Walter's money a very long time ago. And it had nothing to do with what Mark expected. Mark let his hand fall back to the table, the base of his wine glass making a soft tap against the wood. For a moment he seemed satisfied with himself, like a man who had finally said what he had been rehearsing for years. No one clapped. No one joined the toast. The silence that followed felt thicker than before. Linda finally reached for her napkin and smoothed it carefully across her lap, her movements slow and deliberate. She glanced toward the kitchen again where the chocolate cake waited under its glass dome. I had seen that look before. It was the look people use when they hope dessert might quietly end an uncomfortable conversation. But Mark wasn't finished. I mean, he continued, shrugging his shoulders slightly, we're all just being honest here, right? His tone had changed again. The joking edge was still there, but underneath it was something firmer now. Something that sounded almost rehearsed. He looked around the table like a man searching for agreement. My nephew shifted in his chair but didn't speak. Emily stared down at her hands. Even the couple from next door, who had come over just to celebrate a birthday dinner, sat very still, their polite smiles gone. Mark exhaled slowly, as if disappointed by the lack of support. Look, he said, softening his voice, nobody's trying to take anything away from you, Mom. He leaned forward slightly, his forearms resting on the table. We just think, maybe it's time to start thinking about the future. The word future hung in the air like something carefully chosen. I had heard that word before. Over the past 12 years, Mark had used it many times. Sometimes during quiet visits on Sunday afternoons. Sometimes during long phone calls that always seemed to circle back to the same subject. The future. Usually that word appeared right before he mentioned the lake house. Or the investment accounts. Or the trust Walter had once told me about late one evening while we sat on the porch listening to crickets. Mark continued, speaking slowly now. You've done a lot for the family over the years, he said. Nobody's denying that. Linda nodded faintly beside him, her eyes still lowered. But things change, Mark added. Families grow. Responsibilities grow. He gestured toward Emily and the other younger relatives around the table. College tuition isn't cheap these days. Houses cost a fortune. People could really use help. The way he said help made it sound less like a request and more like a conclusion he had already reached. I watched him carefully. Because what Mark didn't seem to realize was that the entire evening had begun to reveal something far more important than his frustration. It was revealing the plan behind the dinner itself. The invitations. The carefully arranged table. The toast he had waited until everyone was seated to deliver. This wasn't a drunken outburst. It was a performance. And the audience had been chosen very carefully. Mark wanted witnesses. He wanted the entire family present to hear the story he was telling. A story where he appeared reasonable and patient. A son who had waited 12 long years while his elderly mother held on to money that, in his mind, already belonged to the next generation. I lifted my eyes from the candle and looked at my son again. The strange part was that none of this surprised me anymore. Because the truth was, I had suspected something like this might happen for a very long time. In fact, months before my 86th birthday even arrived, I had quietly started preparing for it. Mark straightened his shoulders slightly, as if the silence around the table had begun to bother him. When people don't respond the way you expect, the room starts to feel different. I could see it in his face. The confidence from a moment ago had begun to thin. He cleared his throat and took another sip of wine. "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking," he said again, though his voice wasn't quite as steady this time. No one rushed to confirm that. The candles flickered along the center of the table, their small flames bending every time someone shifted in their seat. Emily glanced toward the kitchen door again, clearly hoping someone would finally bring out the cake. But no one moved. Across the table, my neighbor Harold, an old friend of Walter's, sat quietly with his hands folded over his stomach. Harold had been Walter's fishing partner for years. They used to disappear to the lake house every spring with a cooler full of sandwiches and come back hours later smelling like fresh water and pine trees. Harold hadn't spoken much during dinner, but I noticed he had been watching Mark carefully since the toast. Mark finally lowered his glass and leaned back in his chair again. "Look, Mom," he said, trying to soften his tone. "We're family. That's all this is about." The word family seemed to echo slightly in the quiet room. He gestured around the table again. "Everybody here cares about each other. We all want what's fair." Linda nodded once, quickly. "Mark's just worried about the future," she said. Her voice was calm and polite, but she still didn't meet my eyes. "He's thinking about everyone." That was when Harold shifted forward in his chair for the first time that evening. It was a small movement, but the sound of his chair legs sliding against the floor made several people look up. Harold set his water glass down carefully. "Walter used to talk about the future too," he said. His voice was steady, the quiet kind of voice people listen to without realizing it. Mark turned toward him, surprised. "Yeah?" Mark said lightly. "Well, Dad and I talked about it plenty." Harold tilted his head slightly. "Did you?" The question wasn't sharp. It wasn't accusing. But it hung in the air in a way that made the room even quieter. Mark shrugged. "Of course. I'm his son." Harold looked down at the table for a moment, as if remembering something from long ago. Then he looked back up at Mark. "Funny thing," he said. "Walter and I had a conversation about that lake house about 2 weeks before he passed." The words made several people glance toward me. Mark's smile faded just a little. "Yeah," he said again, this time slower. Harold nodded calmly. He was sitting out on the porch that evening. The sun was going down across the water. Harold paused for a moment, as if he could still see the lake in his mind. He told me something I always remembered. Mark crossed his arms loosely over his chest. "And what was that?" Harold didn't rush his answer. "He said a man works his whole life to build something stable," Harold said. "But the real test isn't the money." The room stayed silent as he continued. "The real test is whether the people who inherit it understand what it was meant for." Harold leaned back in his chair again, folding his hands in his lap. "Walter was a thoughtful man," he added quietly. "He planned things carefully." Mark gave a small laugh, though it sounded forced now. "Yeah, well," he said, lifting his glass again, "I'm pretty sure I know what Dad meant." I watched the candlelight reflect in the wine as he raised the glass to his lips. Because the truth was, Harold wasn't the only one who remembered that conversation on the lake porch. I remembered it too. And Walter had said something else that night. Something Mark had clearly never heard. Something that had quietly shaped every decision I made after my husband was gone. Harold's words lingered in the air long after he finished speaking. No one rushed to fill the silence. Mark shifted his weight slightly and looked down at his glass, swirling the wine again like he was trying to decide whether to take another sip or set it down. The confidence he had earlier was fading, replaced by a faint irritation. "Dad always liked to talk in riddles," Mark said with a small shrug. "But I'm pretty sure I know what he wanted." Linda nodded beside him, though this time her smile looked tight. Around the table, people avoided looking directly at either of us. It's uncomfortable watching a family disagreement unfold, especially when no one knows how it will end. I rested my hands calmly on the tablecloth. The fabric beneath my fingers felt cool and smooth. I had hosted hundreds of dinners at this table over the years, Thanksgivings, graduations, Christmas mornings that stretched late into the afternoon. But this dinner felt different. Not because of Mark's words. Because of what those words revealed. For years, I had watched small changes in him. At first it was subtle. A question about the investment accounts Walter left behind. A casual remark about how expensive things had become. Then the questions turned more direct. "What are you planning to do with the lake house? Have you thought about putting the accounts in a trust for the family?" He never demanded anything outright. Not in the beginning. He always wrapped the questions in concern. Concern for my age. Concern for the complications that might happen later if things weren't organized the way he thought they should be. But as time passed, the patience in those conversations slowly disappeared. The tone changed. Mark started speaking about the money as if it were already halfway his. Not legally, of course. But in his mind, the outcome seemed obvious. Walter's money would eventually pass down to him. It was simply a matter of timing. And in Mark's mind, that timing had already taken too long. What he never seemed to consider was that I had been paying attention the entire time. People often assume age makes you less aware. That once someone reaches their 80s, they stop noticing the details. But the truth is, you notice more. You listen more carefully. And over 12 years, I had listened to every word Mark said about Walter's money. Every suggestion. Every complaint disguised as concern. By the time my 86th birthday approached, I understood something very clearly. Mark wasn't waiting anymore. He was preparing to push. That's why the dinner didn't surprise me. The toast didn't surprise me either. In fact, the moment he insisted on organizing the celebration himself, I had already begun to suspect how the evening might unfold. Mark believed tonight would pressure me. That standing in front of the entire family would make me uncomfortable enough to finally give in. What he didn't realize was that I had already taken steps long before the candles were ever placed on this table. Steps that began with a quiet meeting on a rainy Tuesday morning 3 years ago. A meeting that Mark never knew about. And if he had known, this birthday toast would probably never have happened at all. The memory of that Tuesday morning came back to me as I sat at the table, listening to Mark breathe a little too loudly through his nose while the room stayed quiet. It had been raining that day, a steady gray rain that made the streets shine like glass. I remember because I had parked 2 blocks away from the office and walked the rest of the distance under a small umbrella Walter bought me years earlier. The building was a modest brick office on Main Street, the kind that houses accountants, insurance agents, and attorneys who have known the same families for decades. The brass plaque beside the door read Franklin and More Legal Services. Walter and I had used that office before for paperwork when he first set up his retirement accounts. The receptionist recognized me when I stepped inside. "Good morning, Mrs. Carter," she said kindly. "Mr. Moore is expecting you." I nodded and hung my umbrella on the stand near the door. The waiting room smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood. I remember sitting there for a moment, looking out the window while rain tapped softly against the glass. I wasn't nervous. Not exactly. But I knew the conversation I was about to have would quietly change the future of our family. When Mr. Moore invited me into his office, he greeted me with the same calm politeness Walter always appreciated. He had gray hair and the patient manner of a man who spent most of his career listening to complicated family stories. "How can I help you today?" he asked. I sat down across from his desk and folded my hands together, much the way they rested on the table now at my birthday dinner. "I'd like to review the arrangements Walter made," I told him. Mr. Moore nodded and opened a folder from his cabinet. Inside were documents Walter had signed years earlier, investment records, property titles, the paperwork connected to the lake house. We went through everything slowly. The house by the lake. The investment accounts Walter had built over 3 decades. The small trust he had created near the end of his life, just in case something unexpected happened. After nearly an hour of careful explanation, Mr. Moore leaned back slightly in his chair. "Everything here is quite straightforward," he said. "Your husband arranged things so that you would have full control while you're alive." I nodded. I already knew that part. Walter had explained it to me himself on that quiet evening on the lake porch. But I hadn't come to the office just to hear the details repeated. "And if I wanted to make changes?" I asked calmly. Mr. Moore adjusted his glasses and studied me for a moment. "You absolutely can," he said. "As the primary holder now, you have that authority." The rain outside had grown heavier by then, drumming steadily against the window. I remember watching the drops slide down the glass as I asked the next question. "What kind of changes are possible?" Mr. Moore folded his hands together on the desk. "That depends on what you want the future to look like." At the time, Mark believed the future was already decided. Sitting at my 86th birthday dinner now, I realized he still believed that. What he didn't understand was that the future he imagined had quietly been rewritten 3 years earlier on a rainy morning he never knew existed. Mr. Moore listened carefully while I explained what had been on my mind. I didn't rush my words. At 83, I had learned that decisions about the future should never be made quickly. "My husband trusted me to manage what he left," I said. Mr. Moore nodded. "That's very clear in these documents." I looked down at the papers spread across his desk. Walter's signature appeared neatly at the bottom of several pages, the same steady handwriting he used his entire life. Seeing it there reminded me of that evening on the lake porch years earlier. The sun had been setting behind the trees, turning the water gold. Walter had been unusually quiet that night. Finally he said something that stayed with me long after he was gone. "If people start asking about the money too soon," he told me, "pay attention." At the time, I didn't fully understand what he meant. But over the years, as Mark's questions became more frequent, those words began to make sense. Sitting in Mr. Moore's office that rainy morning, I thought about every one of those conversations with my son. The polite suggestions. The careful hints. The growing impatience. I lifted my eyes from the papers. "I want to make sure everything continues to be used the way Walter intended," I said. Mr. Moore folded his hands together thoughtfully. "And how do you believe he intended it?" he asked. That was a fair question. Walter had never been the kind of man who spoke dramatically about inheritance or legacy. He believed more in quiet preparation than speeches. But I knew my husband well enough to understand his priorities. "Walter believed money should protect a family," I said slowly. "Not divide it." Mr. Moore nodded again. "That's often the goal." I looked back at the file one more time before speaking. "Then I think it's time to protect it properly." The attorney studied me for a moment, then reached for another folder in his cabinet. "There are several ways to do that," he explained. For the next hour we talked through each possibility. Trust arrangements. Long-term protections. Conditions that would determine how the assets might eventually be distributed. Some options were simple. Others were more detailed. I listened carefully, asking questions when something wasn't clear. Outside, the rain continued falling in a steady rhythm. By the time we finished reviewing everything, the office clock showed nearly noon. Mr. Moore set his pen down and looked at me again. Once these changes are finalized, he said, the structure will be very different from what it is now. I nodded calmly. That's the idea. He hesitated briefly before asking his next question. Have you discussed any of this with your son? I gave a small shake of my head. No, Mr. Moore didn't seem surprised. Would you like me to notify him once the documents are complete? I thought about that for a moment, then smiled slightly. No, I said. There's no need. I folded my umbrella open when I left the office that day, stepping back into the quiet rain. Mark continued asking about Walter's money over the next 3 years. He never knew that the answers he expected had already changed. And sitting at my 86th birthday dinner now, watching him swirl the wine in his glass while he spoke about fairness and family, I realized something else. Tonight might be the first time he finally learns what those changes really mean. Mark took another slow sip of wine, then set the glass down a little harder than before. The bass clicked against the table, sharp enough that a few people looked up again. He glanced around the room like a man expecting someone to support him, but the silence hadn't changed. Finally he let out a breath and rubbed his hand across the back of his neck. All right, he said, trying to sound casual again. Maybe I didn't say it the right way. Linda gave a quick nod beside him, relieved to hear the shift in his tone. Mark just means we should talk about these things openly, she added. Families should be able to discuss the future. I looked at her for a moment. Linda had always chosen her words carefully. Even now, she was trying to smooth the edges of what Mark had already said. But the truth was, the conversation had already moved too far for polite adjustments. Mark leaned forward again, resting both hands on the table. Look, Mom, he said, lowering his voice slightly. No one's saying you did anything wrong. He paused, choosing the next words carefully. But at some point, these decisions affect everyone. The word everyone seemed to hang in the air again. I could see Emily watching quietly from the other end of the table, her expression thoughtful now instead of embarrassed. Harold sat back in his chair, observing without interrupting. The candles had burned lower, their wax slowly pooling at the base. Mark continued, speaking with the calm tone of someone presenting a logical argument. Dad worked hard for that money, he said. And he wanted the family to benefit from it. I nodded slightly. Yes, I said softly. My voice was calm, but it was the first word I had spoken since his toast. The room shifted almost immediately. Sometimes a single word can carry more weight than a long speech. Mark seemed encouraged by my response. Exactly, he said quickly. That's all I'm saying. He leaned back again, spreading his hands slightly. We should start thinking about how things move forward. I folded my hands together on the table. For a moment I studied the flame of the candle in front of me. Then I lifted my eyes and looked at my son. You're right about one thing, I said. The entire table seemed to lean closer without realizing it. Your father did work very hard, I continued. And he thought very carefully about what should happen to everything he built. Mark nodded immediately. That's what I've been trying to explain. I gave a small, patient smile. I know. Linda shifted again in her chair, watching me now with more attention than before. Mark picked up his wine glass again but didn't drink. So maybe, he said, we should finally talk about what he intended. The clock in the hallway ticked quietly behind us. I could feel the attention of everyone at the table now. Some curious. Some nervous. For 12 years Mark had believed the future of Walter's money was simply waiting for me to let go. What he didn't realize was that the future he imagined no longer existed. I rested my hands gently on the tablecloth and spoke in the same calm voice I had used all evening. We can talk about it, I said. In fact, I think it's time. Mark smiled, relieved. Good, he said. But the smile faded slightly when I added my next sentence. Because the arrangements your father made, I said slowly, are not what you think they are anymore. The room went very quiet again. And for the first time that evening, Mark looked at me with real uncertainty. Mark's smile lingered for a moment, but it was no longer as confident as before. What do you mean? He asked. The question came out quickly, almost automatically, as if he expected the answer to be simple. I kept my voice calm. 3 years ago, I said, I reviewed all of your father's arrangements with our attorney. Linda's head lifted slightly at that. Mark frowned. Reviewed? I nodded. Yes. I reached for my water glass and took a small sip before continuing. Your father left everything in a structure that gave me full authority while I'm alive. Mark waved his hand lightly. Right. I know that part. But there was a faint tension in his voice now. He had expected control to eventually pass to him in a clear, predictable line. That assumption had been guiding his questions for years. I folded my hands together again. What you didn't know, I continued, is that I also had the right to change how things are handled after I'm gone. The words settled slowly across the table. Mark stared at me for a second, processing them. Change it, how? He asked. His tone was cautious now. Linda's posture had stiffened beside him. Across the table, Harold watched quietly, his expression thoughtful. The candles had burned almost to the base of their wicks. I spoke slowly, making sure every word was clear. Walter believed money should protect the family, I said. Not create arguments like this. Mark gave a short breath that almost sounded like a laugh. Mom, nobody's arguing. I looked at him calmly. You stood up at my birthday dinner and accused me of holding on to your father's money. The room stayed quiet. Mark didn't respond. I continued gently. That's exactly the kind of situation your father worried about. Linda shifted again, glancing briefly toward the other guests. But no one interrupted. I rested my hands lightly on the table. 3 years ago, I made adjustments to the way everything is structured. Mark's eyes narrowed slightly. Adjustments, he repeated. Yes. I kept my tone steady. The lake house. The investment accounts. All of it. Mark leaned back in his chair slowly now, studying my face as if he were trying to determine whether I was joking. So what does that mean? He asked. I looked at him the same way I had looked at him when he was a boy asking questions across this very table. Patiently. Clearly. It means, I said, that none of those assets transfer directly to any one person anymore. Linda blinked. Mark straightened in his chair. What? The word slipped out before he could stop it. I continued calmly. After I'm gone, everything will move into a family foundation your father and I established through the trust. No one spoke. Mark stared at me as if he had misheard something. A foundation, he said slowly. I nodded. Yes. I glanced briefly toward Emily and the others at the table. Its purpose is to fund college education for the grandchildren, maintain the lake house for shared family use, and support several local scholarships your father cared about. Mark's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out at first. I gave a small, gentle smile. In other words, I said quietly, the money will still support the family. Then I met his eyes again. But it will never belong to just one person. For a long moment, no one at the table said anything. Mark sat there staring at me, his wine glass still in his hand, though he had stopped drinking from it. The confidence that filled the room earlier had completely disappeared from his face. A foundation, he repeated quietly. I nodded once. Yes. Linda was the first to speak after that. But, that means the money isn't passed down, she asked carefully. It is passed down, I said gently. Just not in the way you expected. The candle in front of me flickered as someone shifted in their chair. The wax had nearly melted all the way down now, forming a small pool around the base. Emily leaned forward slightly. "So the lake house stays in the family?" she asked. I smiled at her. "Yes. That was very important to your grandfather." A small wave of relief moved across her face. "Anyone in the family can use it," I continued. "The trust will maintain the property. Repairs, taxes, everything." Harold gave a quiet nod from across the table. "That sounds like Walter," he said softly. Mark rubbed his hand slowly across his jaw, still trying to process everything. "So, nobody owns it?" he asked. "No," I said calmly. "It belongs to the foundation. Which means it belongs to the purpose your father believed in." Linda looked down at the table. "And the investment accounts?" "They fund scholarships," I said. "Some for our family. Some for students in town who need help paying for college." For the first time that evening, the room felt different. The tension had faded, replaced by something quieter. Something thoughtful. Mark leaned back in his chair and stared at the candlelight for a moment. "You did all that 3 years ago?" he asked. "Yes. And you never told me?" I gave a small smile. "You never asked what your father wanted the money to do," I said. "You only asked when it would become yours." He didn't respond to that. Across the table, someone finally let out a slow breath. Linda reached for her water glass. Emily looked toward the kitchen again. Then she stood up suddenly. "I think it's time for the cake," she said softly. A few people laughed quietly, the kind of gentle laughter that releases tension from a room. She disappeared into the kitchen and returned a moment later carrying the chocolate cake under its glass dome. 86 candles would have been too many, so she had placed just 2 on top. An 8 and a 6. She set the cake in front of me and lit them carefully. The small flames glowed warmly in the dim room. For a moment, everyone simply watched them. Then Harold raised his glass. "This one's simple," he said. "To Walter." He nodded toward me. "And to the woman who understood him." Several glasses lifted quietly around the table. This time, the room felt warm again. Not perfect. Families rarely are. But calmer. More honest. I looked down at the cake for a moment before blowing out the candles. Walter had once told me something on that quiet lake porch years ago. "Money doesn't show you who people are," he said. "It only gives them the chance to show themselves." That night, at my 86th birthday dinner, my son finally understood something his father learned a long time ago. Some things in a family are meant to be shared, not owned. And as the candles faded into a thin trail of smoke, I realized the lake house would still be there next summer. The dock. The quiet water. The porch where Walter and I once watched the sun go down. And for the first time in many years, I felt certain that what he built would remain exactly what he intended. A place for the family. Not a prize to fight over.